They said only a madman would do what he was planning. Once you'd tasted freedom in the North, once you'd lived as a man instead of property, once you'd escaped the daily terror of slavery's brutality, no sane person would voluntarily return to the South, where recapture meant torture and probably death. But Elijah Hayes wasn't concerned with what sane people would do. He was concerned with the fact that his wife Sarah was still enslaved on the Morrison plantation in Tennessee, that he'd been forced to escape without her when their plan fell apart, that he'd promised her as he fled that he would come back no matter what it cost. 17 months had passed since his escape in February 1857, 17 months of freedom in Ohio, working as a blacksmith, building a new life, lying awake every night thinking about Sarah still trapped in bondage, 17 months of saving money and planning and gathering intelligence about the plantation's routines. And now, in July 1858, Elijah was going back, disguised as a free black tradesman, walking voluntarily into the lion's den to bring Sarah out or die trying. This is the story of a love so powerful it conquered the most rational fear a freed person could have, the fear of being enslaved again. This is the story of Elijah and Sarah, of a promise kept at terrible risk, of what it means to choose love over safety when the stakes are literally life and death, and whether such choices are heroic or foolish, or simply what love demands when someone you care about remains in chains. My name is Elijah Hayes. I was born enslaved in 1829 on the Morrison plantation in Tennessee, son of a blacksmith named Jacob, who taught me his trade before he was sold away when I was 12. I spent my youth learning to work iron and steel, became the plantation's blacksmith at age 16, spent 14 years making tools and chains and horseshoes, using my skills to make slavery function more efficiently, even as I dreamed of destroying the whole system. I met Sarah in 1851 when I was 22 and she was 19. She'd been purchased by Morrison from a neighboring plantation, brought to work in the big house as a lady's maid for Mistress Morrison. Sarah was beautiful and intelligent, could read despite laws against it, carried herself with quiet dignity that slavery hadn't broken. I loved her immediately, that instant recognition of someone whose spirit matched your own. We courted carefully over months, knowing that enslaved people developing relationships was discouraged unless it served masters' breeding interests. But we found moments, conversations, while I delivered ironwork to the big house, meetings at the well on Sunday evenings, stolen minutes that became the foundation of love. We jumped the broom in December 1851, the informal marriage ceremony enslaved people used since legal marriage wasn't allowed. We had our ceremony in the quarters, with the enslaved community witnessing, exchanged vows that meant everything, even though they had no legal standing. We were husband and wife in every way that mattered to us, even though the law said we were just property that happened to live together. Master Morrison gave us a cabin, glad to have his blacksmith settled and potentially producing children who'd become his property. We built a life in the narrow space slavery allowed, 5 years of love and partnership constrained by bondage, but real nonetheless. We worked during the day, held each other at night, talked about the impossible dream every enslaved person carried, freedom. We planned our escape carefully over 2 years. I made contacts with Underground Railroad conductors who passed through Tennessee, learned routes north to Kentucky and then Ohio, saved money from occasional outside work Morrison allowed me to do. Sarah gathered information from the big house, learned when Morrison traveled, understood the plantation's vulnerabilities. Our plan was to escape together in February 1857, both of us fleeing the same night, making it to a conductor's safe house 10 miles away, then following the railroad north. We'd planned it down to the smallest detail, rehearsed every step, prepared for contingencies. Then everything fell apart. 3 days before our planned escape, Morrison sold Sarah's mother to a plantation in Alabama. Sarah was devastated, wanted to delay the escape, needed time to process the loss. I argued we couldn't delay. The window of opportunity would close. We had to go now, or risk losing our chance entirely. We fought about it. The only serious fight we'd had in 5 years of marriage. Sarah said I was being heartless, that her mother deserved time to mourn, that freedom could wait a few more weeks. I said waiting was too dangerous, that the railroad conductor wouldn't be available later, that we had to go now. The argument was still unresolved when the escape night arrived. I went to our meeting point at midnight, the abandoned tobacco barn where we'd agreed to rendezvous before starting our journey north. I waited for Sarah. She never came. I should have gone to find her, should have checked if something had happened, if she was in danger, if she needed help. But time was critical. The conductor was waiting at his safe house. The window for escape was closing. Every minute I delayed increased the risk of being caught, so I made a choice that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I left without her, ran north alone, telling myself I'd come back for her, that this was temporary, that I'd rescue her once I was free and established. I ran through Tennessee darkness, found the conductor's safe house, began the journey north on the Underground Railroad, escaped to Ohio by March 1857. I was free, and I was devastated. Free but alone, safe but racked with guilt, liberated but haunted by the woman I'd left behind. Every moment of freedom was shadowed by knowledge that Sarah was still enslaved, that I'd abandoned her when she needed time to grieve, that I'd chosen my own liberation over waiting for her. I sent word back through the railroad network, messages asking conductors to contact Sarah, to tell her where I was, to arrange for her escape. But the responses that came back were discouraging. Sarah was being watched more carefully now that I'd escaped. Morrison suspected she'd known about my plans. She was confined to the plantation, rarely allowed off the property, under constant supervision. Escape would be nearly impossible without help from someone who could get onto the plantation itself. I worked in Ohio as a blacksmith, lived in a boarding house in Cincinnati, built connections in the free black community, saved every penny I earned. I was living the dream every enslaved person had: freedom, wages, autonomy, safety from masters and overseers. But the dream felt hollow without Sarah. The letters started arriving in June 1857, 4 months after my escape. Letters smuggled north through sympathetic conductors, written by Sarah in her careful hidden literacy. They told me about her life on the plantation without me, about how Morrison had increased her workload as punishment for my escape, about how she missed me constantly, about how she didn't blame me for leaving but wished I'd waited, about how she'd been unable to come that night because Mistress Morrison had been sick and Sarah had been required to stay in the big house. She'd tried to escape twice since I left, the letters revealed. Both attempts had failed. She'd been caught the first time before leaving the plantation, whipped severely and locked in a storage room for a week. The second attempt had gotten further. She'd made it 5 miles before slave catchers' dogs found her, dragged her back, and she'd been whipped again even more brutally. Morrison was now threatening to sell her to the Deep South if she tried to escape again. Cotton plantations in Mississippi or Alabama, where survival rates were terrible, where she'd be worked to death within years. The threat was real. Morrison was tired of dealing with an uppity enslaved woman who kept trying to run. I had to get her out. But how? I was free in Ohio, but returning to Tennessee meant risking recapture. If I was caught, I'd be enslaved again, probably sold away to the Deep South myself as punishment for escaping and returning. The Fugitive Slave Act meant even northern states weren't completely safe, but returning to the South was suicide. Yet leaving Sarah there, knowing she was suffering and in danger of being sold, that felt worse than any physical risk to myself. I'd promised her as I fled that night that I would come back. Time to keep that promise. I spent a year planning from March 1857 to July 1858. I worked constantly, saved money, gathered information, studied the Morrison plantation from letters Sarah sent, learned everything I could about how to return to the South safely. The plan that emerged was risky, but possible. I'd return to Tennessee disguised as a free black tradesman, using forged free papers that documented me as Samuel Jackson, a freeman blacksmith from Kentucky. I'd get hired to do work on the Morrison plantation or a neighboring property, get access to the plantation, make contact with Sarah, and help her escape. Then we'd both flee north together, hopefully before anyone realized who I actually was. The free black community in Ohio helped me prepare. They connected me with a man who forged excellent free papers, documents that could withstand most scrutiny. They taught me how to act like a free tradesman from Kentucky, how to speak differently, how to present myself as someone who'd been born free rather than escaped from slavery. They gave me money, contacts and plans for multiple escape routes. They also warned me I was insane, that returning to the South after escaping was the most dangerous thing a freed person could do, that if I was recognized, I'd be tortured and sold so far south I'd never see freedom again, that I was throwing away everything I'd earned, risking a life of liberty for a rescue attempt that would probably fail. But I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. Sarah was still enslaved because of choices I'd made. I'd left her behind in my rush to escape. I owed her this attempt, regardless of personal risk. Before I tell you what happened when I returned to Tennessee, I want you to drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about the real meaning of love and courage during slavery. These are the stories of people who risked everything for each other. Now back to July 1858, where I was about to walk back into bondage after tasting freedom. I left Cincinnati in early July 1858, carrying forged free papers, tools for blacksmith work, and a cover story I'd rehearsed until it was second nature. I was Samuel Jackson, born free in Kentucky, traveling through Tennessee looking for blacksmith work, willing to do quality ironwork for fair wages. I dressed like a free tradesman, wore decent clothes, carried myself with the confidence free black men were allowed to show, played the role completely. The journey south was terrifying. Every mile closer to Tennessee was a mile closer to potential recapture. Every white person who looked at me too long made my heart race. Every sheriff or slave patrol I passed was a moment where my forged papers might be scrutinized and found wanting. I traveled by coach and on foot, paid for meals and lodging, acted like a free man going about normal business, all while terror coiled in my stomach. I reached Tennessee in mid-July, found a boarding house in a small town 15 miles from the Morrison plantation, established myself as Samuel Jackson, the itinerant blacksmith. I did work for local farmers, repaired tools and equipment, built my reputation as a skilled tradesman, asked around about plantation work. After 2 weeks of establishing my cover, I got what I needed. A large plantation 10 miles from Morrison's needed extensive ironwork done, fence repairs, new gates, tools sharpened and replaced, a week's worth of work, maybe more. I bid for the job, offered competitive prices, got hired based on my demonstrated skill, and the excellent forged recommendations my free black friends had created. The plantation was close enough to Morrison's that workers from both properties knew each other. I could ask casual questions about neighboring plantations, learn about Morrison's current situation, find people who might carry messages, all while appearing to be just a free tradesman doing his job. I learned that Morrison had indeed grown more suspicious and cruel after my escape, that he watched Sarah constantly, blamed her for my disappearance even though she'd had nothing to do with it, that he'd threatened multiple times to sell her if she caused any more trouble, that he'd increased security on the plantation, hired additional overseers, made escape attempts much more difficult. But I also learned Morrison would be traveling to Nashville in early August for a week-long business trip. That security would be slightly relaxed during his absence, that there would be a window, small but real, when escape might be possible. I had 3 weeks to make contact with Sarah, let her know I was here, plan our escape, and execute it before Morrison returned, and before anyone recognized me as Elijah Hayes, escaped slave, rather than Samuel Jackson, free tradesman. Making contact was the hardest part. I couldn't just appear at Morrison's plantation and ask for Sarah. That would raise immediate suspicion. I needed a legitimate reason to be there, or I needed someone else to carry messages. The solution came through one of the enslaved men on the plantation where I was working. His name was Daniel. He had a sister named Ruth who lived on Morrison's plantation, and he visited her on Sundays when both properties allowed brief social visits between neighboring plantations' enslaved populations. I approached Daniel carefully, told him I'd heard there was a skilled seamstress named Sarah at Morrison's plantation, that my wife back in Kentucky needed some fine sewing done, asked if he could carry a message asking about her services. It was a thin cover story, but plausible enough. Daniel agreed, probably suspecting something but willing to help. He carried my message to Morrison's plantation that Sunday, gave it to Ruth, asked her to deliver it to Sarah. The message was carefully coded. "I'm interested in your sewing services. I'm a blacksmith working nearby for 2 more weeks. If you're available, please send word through Ruth about your prices and availability. Signed, Samuel Jackson." Sarah would recognize the blacksmith reference, would understand that someone claiming to be a blacksmith was asking about her, would hopefully realize it was me. The response came back the following Sunday. Ruth gave Daniel a message from Sarah for the blacksmith interested in sewing work. The message said, "I'd be happy to discuss sewing services. I'm available most evenings after my housework is finished. You could visit Morrison Plantation next Sunday afternoon if you'd like to discuss details." My heart nearly stopped. Sarah had understood, had recognized something in the message that suggested it might be me, was inviting me to the plantation, giving me access, creating an opportunity. But it was also incredibly dangerous. Appearing at Morrison's plantation meant being seen by people who'd known me for years. My disguise was good. I'd grown a beard and changed my appearance. But someone might recognize me. If Morrison was there, I'd almost certainly be identified. Everything depended on timing and luck, and whether my disguise was convincing enough. I had 1 week to prepare, refined my cover story, practiced my fake Kentucky accent, made sure my free papers were perfect, prepared for every question I might face. I also prepared escape plans, studied routes north from Morrison's plantation, identified safe houses and hiding spots, readied myself for the possibility that everything would go wrong and we'd have to run immediately. The following Sunday, I walked up to Morrison's plantation as Samuel Jackson, free blacksmith from Kentucky, there to discuss sewing services with a slave named Sarah. I carried my forged papers, wore my best clothes, projected the confidence free black men were allowed. The overseer at the gate looked at me suspiciously. "What's your business here?" "I'm Samuel Jackson, freeman from Kentucky. I'm a blacksmith working at the Crawford plantation. I heard you have a talented seamstress here named Sarah. My wife needs some sewing done, and I wanted to discuss whether Sarah might be available for the work." He examined my papers, compared my face to the description, looked for any sign of deception. The papers held up. After a tense minute, he nodded. "Sarah works in the big house. I'll send for her. You can wait here." I waited by the gate, every nerve on edge, scanning the plantation for familiar faces. The place looked the same as when I'd left, the same buildings and fields and routines. But everything felt different. I was seeing it as a free man returning voluntarily, rather than an enslaved man trapped here. The psychological difference was profound. Sarah appeared 5 minutes later, walking from the big house, accompanied by a young enslaved woman who was clearly there to supervise the interaction. She saw me from 50 feet away and froze. I saw recognition flash across her face, saw her process that I'd actually come back, saw fear and joy and disbelief warring in her expression. Then she recovered her composure, kept walking, approached me with the neutral expression enslaved people learned to wear around white people. The young woman supervising her watched carefully, making sure nothing inappropriate happened. "You're the blacksmith, interested in sewing work?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled. "Yes, ma'am. Samuel Jackson, freeman from Kentucky. I heard you're a talented seamstress. My wife back in Kentucky needs some dresses made, and I wanted to see if you might be available." We conducted a completely normal conversation about sewing services, prices, and timelines. To anyone listening, it was just business. But our eyes told different stories. Sarah's eyes asked, "Is it really you? Did you actually come back? Are we really doing this?" My eyes answered, "Yes, I'm here. I came back like I promised. We're getting you out." After 10 minutes of discussing fictional sewing projects, I told Sarah I'd need to consult with my wife about exactly what she wanted. Could I return next Sunday to discuss further? Sarah agreed, said she'd prepare some fabric samples to show me. We scheduled another meeting for the following Sunday. I left the plantation, walked back to my boarding house, and allowed myself to feel the terror I'd been suppressing. I'd been on Morrison's plantation, walked past places where I'd worked as an enslaved blacksmith, talked to Sarah while pretending to be someone else, and no one had recognized me. The disguise had held, the forged papers had worked. We had a chance. Over the next week, I finalized plans. Morrison was leaving for Nashville in 4 days. He'd be gone for a week, returning the following Sunday. That gave us a 6-day window when security would be slightly relaxed. We'd escape on the 3rd night of his absence, giving him time to get to Nashville, but leaving enough time before his return that the manhunt wouldn't be organized until we had a head start. I sent coded messages through Daniel and Ruth, telling Sarah to be ready to leave Wednesday night, to pack nothing that would be noticed missing, to meet me at the old tobacco barn at midnight, the same barn where we'd planned to meet for our first escape attempt 17 months ago. The same plan we'd failed to execute then. This time I was determined it would work. Wednesday arrived. Morrison had left for Nashville 2 days earlier. Security was slightly reduced but still present. I finished my work at Crawford Plantation, told them I'd completed the job and would be moving on to look for work elsewhere. They paid me, wrote me an excellent recommendation, sent me on my way. No one suspected the free blacksmith was actually an escaped slave about to commit his second escape. I spent that day preparing, bought supplies for the journey north, secured horses from a freedman who owed favors to the Underground Railroad network, positioned everything we'd need at strategic points along our escape route. Then I waited for midnight, terror and hope fighting for dominance in my chest. At 11:30, I approached the Morrison plantation from the woods, moving carefully to avoid patrols. The night was dark, clouds covering the moon, perfect conditions for escape. I reached the tobacco barn at 11:45, hid in the shadows, waited for Sarah. She appeared at midnight exactly, moving silently through darkness, a small bundle under her arm containing things too precious to leave behind. She'd made it out of the house undetected, made it across the plantation grounds, made it to the meeting point. She saw me and ran the last 20 feet, threw herself into my arms, held me like she'd never let go. We stood there for a long moment, reunited after 17 months of separation, tears streaming down both our faces. "You came back," she whispered. "You actually came back." "I promised I would," I said. "I always keep my promises to you. Are you ready to go?" "More ready than I've ever been for anything." We ran, left Morrison's plantation behind, moved north through Tennessee darkness, followed the route I'd planned over months of preparation. We reached the hidden horses by 2 in the morning, mounted and rode hard for the Kentucky border. We had maybe 6 hours before Sarah's absence would be discovered, maybe 8 before a serious search would begin, maybe 12 before slave catchers would be mobilized. Every hour of head start was precious. We rode through the night, reached Kentucky by dawn, kept moving north toward Ohio. We hid during the day in a safe house operated by Underground Railroad conductors, traveled by night when slave catchers were less active, made steady progress toward free territory. The journey took 5 days of hard travel, moving fast, taking risks, gambling that speed would get us to freedom before pursuit caught up. We reached Ohio on Monday evening, crossed the invisible line from slave state to free state, collapsed in exhaustion at a Cincinnati safe house operated by the same free black community that had helped me prepare. We'd done it. Sarah was free. We were together. The 17 months of separation were over. The risk of returning to the South had paid off, but the terror wasn't over. The Fugitive Slave Act meant Sarah could still be captured and returned to Morrison even in Ohio. We needed to get further north, into Canada, where British law didn't recognize slavery, where she'd be legally safe from recapture. We stayed in Cincinnati for 2 days, resting and gathering supplies. Then we traveled north again, this time toward Lake Erie and Detroit, aiming for the Canadian border. We crossed into Canada in mid-August 1858, 17 months after I'd escaped, 6 weeks after I'd returned to Tennessee to get Sarah, 1 month after the most terrifying and dangerous action of my life. We settled in a small town outside Toronto, found work, built a life in a place where slavery didn't exist, where Sarah couldn't be recaptured, where we could finally be husband and wife without fear. I worked as a blacksmith. Sarah worked as a seamstress. We were poor but free, struggling but together, building the life we dreamed about during 5 years of enslaved marriage. People asked me over the years why I'd taken the risk of returning to Tennessee after escaping, why I'd voluntarily walked back into slavery territory when I was safe in Ohio, why I'd risked recapture, torture, and being sold to the Deep South. The answer was always simple: because Sarah was still enslaved, and I'd promised to come back for her. Because love means keeping promises even when they're terrifying. Because freedom without the person you love is incomplete. Because some things are worth any risk, and rescuing someone you care about from bondage is at the top of that list. We lived in Canada for the rest of our lives, raised 4 children born free, worked hard, and built a modest prosperity. The Civil War came and went. Slavery ended in America, but we never returned to the United States. Canada was home now, the place where we'd finally achieved the freedom and safety we'd dreamed about. Sarah died in 1896 at age 64, her heart weakening after years of hard work. I held her hand while she died, grateful for the 38 years we'd had together after I rescued her, grateful I'd made the choice to return, despite the risk, grateful that love had proven stronger than fear. I died 4 years later in 1900 at age 71, having lived 42 years as a free man after 28 years of slavery. 42 years with Sarah for most of them, building a life together, raising free children, proving that the risk I'd taken in 1858 had been worthwhile. On my deathbed, a young man asked me if I'd been afraid when I returned to Tennessee to rescue Sarah, if I'd been terrified walking back into slavery territory after escaping. Of course I was afraid, I said. I was terrified every moment, terrified of being recognized, of being recaptured, of failing to save Sarah, of being sold to the Deep South. But fear doesn't erase obligation. I'd left Sarah behind when I escaped. I owed her this rescue attempt regardless of personal terror. Was it worth the risk? He asked. I looked at him seriously. I spent 17 months free and alone and 38 years free with Sarah. Those 38 years were worth any risk. Love means keeping promises even when they're dangerous, especially when they're dangerous. He asked one final question. Would you do it again? Would you return to the South after escaping if you had to make that choice again? Without hesitation, I said, every time, 1,000 times, because freedom means nothing if you achieve it by abandoning people you love, because promises matter, because Sarah deserved someone willing to risk everything to bring her home. This was the story of Elijah Hayes, born enslaved in Tennessee in 1829, married Sarah in 1851, escaped to Ohio in February 1857 after a planned joint escape fell apart, spent 17 months free and alone while Sarah remained enslaved, voluntarily returned to Tennessee in July 1858, disguised as a free tradesman, successfully rescued Sarah from Morrison Plantation in early August 1858, escaped with her to Canada, where they lived free for the rest of their lives, raising 4 children and building a life together until Sarah's death in 1896 and Elijah's in 1900. His choice to return to the South after escaping became legendary in Underground Railroad networks as an example of the extraordinary risks people took for love, demonstrating that the strongest human drive isn't self-preservation, but the need to protect and rescue those we care about regardless of personal danger. The echoes of Elijah's choice remind us that freedom, however precious, feels hollow when achieved by abandoning people we love, that promises kept at terrible risk are the truest measure of devotion, and that sometimes the bravest act is voluntarily walking back into danger to bring someone out. If this story of love conquering the most rational fear moved you, subscribe to hear more untold stories of courage and sacrifice during America's darkest chapter. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what resonated most about Elijah's decision to risk his freedom to rescue Sarah.